How would I program for maximum hypertrophy for a bodybuilder with low stress level who can afford 5 sessions a week? So a bodybuilder with low stress for maximum hypertrophy 5 times a week, I would do a routine where you're training each body part once every 5 days. So let's say arms and shoulders on day 1, lower body on day 2, off on day 3, chest and back on day 4, off on day 5, and repeat. So here I'm assuming that the client can train any time of the week. Like there is no restriction as cannot train on weekends, for example. So now what happens is on a 3-week period, each body part can be trained 4 times. And now I would make sure I drive the volume to a greater extent. Okay, so anywhere from 22, 24 sets to 36 sets per session, depending on the method you're using. And also at a certain point, if schedule allows, I would do phases like concentrated blocks where I'm doing 2-a-days to really try to get to a point of overreaching to push a component of super compensation later on. I think that works really, really well with bodybuilders who have no stress, who basically just train for a living. That's a really good approach. Now, another split that I like, and it's a split that I talked about in another episode, like in the beginning, but it's where you're doing on a Monday to Friday training period. You're doing chest and back, lower body quad dominant, arms and shoulders, posterior chain, repeat chest and back. Then you have the weekend off. Then the week after is lower body quad dominant, arms and shoulders, day off where you're doing remedial work. Then you have chest and back. Then you have posterior chains. Then week 3, you're back to arms and shoulders, quad dominant, chest and back, posterior chain, arms and shoulders. So what I like about that is you're training 5 days a week with the weekend off, but now the big lower body, the quad movements, the quad session will be trained 3 times in 3 weeks, the posterior chain 3 times in 3 weeks, but then the smaller muscles of the upper body, they will all be trained 4 times in 3 weeks. So the smaller muscles that recover a little bit quicker, you can target them a little more often, and the bigger muscles that recuperate a little bit slower, you target them a little bit less. I really, really like that split. And even with that split, I would eventually also do concentrated blocks where I'm doing 2-a-days. But 2-a-days really work for a short period of time. For bodybuilders, we're talking about like 4 to maybe all the way up to 8 weeks, depending on the working tolerance, training tolerance of the athlete. But you have to make sure that the stress level is low. So strictly for hypertrophy purposes, what's best between 4 sets of 12 done in a step loading fashion or 4 sets of 12 done to failure? If the goal is strictly hypertrophy at such low intensities, you're better off doing 4 sets of 12 to failure, okay? Because here, technique rehearsal, blah, 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 like neuropotentiation, it's not really a factor. We're looking straight up for a metabolic training effect. So you want to go to failure, especially for hypertrophy, because going to failure with intensities that low, like we're talking about 70% of intensity, the only way you can reach a maximum muscle tension is by going through failure. So you don't really have a choice here if your goal is hypertrophy. Keep in mind that 4 sets of 12, technically speaking, will happen a little bit more in your B and or C series than it does in the A series. But when it does happen in the A series, when the goal is purely hypertrophy, go to failure. In which scenario would I use chains for a skull crusher, also known as tricep extensions? For a single joint exercise like tricep extension, the only reason why I would use chains is more for a hypertrophy response. So to accommodate the resistance by adding more load as you're completing your extension, to prolong a little bit the time under tension during your concentric range to create a bigger hypertrophy response. So in your C series, for example, in a phase where you're emphasizing hypertrophy or in a accumulation phase, you could add chains, like 20% chains to the barbell to just make it harder during your ascending curve. So the concentric contraction to create a little bit more mechanical stress to induce more hypertrophy. So that's how I would use chains with tricep extension. Do I provide any types of finisher for fat loss clients? It really depends. Typically, I like to separate strength training to energy system work, to conditioning training as separate sessions. But in certain situations, especially with entry-level clients that are looking for fat loss, that have limited training availability, what I will do is I will often do like a strength training session that lasts 35 to 40 minutes maybe, where I'm focusing on the big lifts and I'm focusing on them just getting better at these lifts, getting stronger at these lifts. And then the last 20 minutes or so, I do more of a conditioning modified strongman circuit where I'm really driving metabolic work. The advantage of that is the learning curve is much easier. It's much easier to do any type of these modified strongmen like sled, prowler, and stuff like that than it is to learn to squat or deadlift. So it allows them to free up their mind, if you want, focus on the task at hand, and creating a lot of metabolic work because it's so concentric dominant. You can do a lot of reps in a short amount of time to boost lactate buildup. So they're going to feel the burn. They're going to move their entire body, move some outside load with all the complexity of technique. So metabolically speaking, they will exert more and burn a little bit more calories. So I think this is very effective for that type of clientele. But if you're training an advanced trainee at a high level of strength, I think you'd be doing a disservice by mixing these two completely different modalities within the same session. You're far better off focusing on strength for one session, and then you could add another session at the end of the day where now you're focusing more on the conditioning aspect. You'll get way more benefits doing that. How do I progress the split squat with a general population client? So the split squat, so it's a great general exercise for lower body for sure. What I like about it is it allows you to work at the ankle joint and creating more dorsiflexion. Allows you to really work the quad by pushing the knees in front of the toes to create more range of motion at the knee joint. Allows you to stretch the rec fem and hip flexor of the back leg. So there's a lot of learning with the split squat. It's far more technical than it seems like, so it needs to be well coached. Now, the progression for the split squat, you want to start with most of your general population client with a front foot elevated. Typically, I elevate the foot 6 inches, but there might be certain cases where the client is so tight at the hip joint that you actually need to elevate it even more, maybe at mid-shin level. That's fine. But typically 6 inches for most will do the trick. So by elevating the front foot, it allows you to better move forward. Like the tip we always give clients at Kilo is go down in an escalator, not an elevator. So you're not going straight up and down, you're going down and forward. So the hips go down and forward so that the knee travels in front of the toe. So you're creating more dorsiflexion and you're creating more knee joint angle work. So you're working that quad through a greater range of motion. And then you try to stay as upright as you can to really stretch that hip area. So the front foot elevated allows you to do that even better. And one added little tip, you can even use a low pulley using the contralateral hand to kind of enable or create that effect of going forward. And it also forces you to stay more upright. So there's a lot of win-win with using the low pulley. Then, once the client becomes efficient with the front foot elevated, you can move down to the front foot flat, which requires a little bit more flexibility if you want to be able to still have the knee going past the toes. And then finally, you can progress to a Bulgarian split squat or rear foot elevated split squat, where now the back foot is elevated 6 inches. Try not to go above 6 inches, because if you go higher than 6 inches, now the issue is the exercise becomes one more of a rec fem flexibility exercise than it is one to emphasize the knee joint and the ankle joint of the front foot. Because if you're so elevated, you're going to notice that the knee joint of the front, the working leg, becomes very, like it's not an acute angle, it's like you're almost at 90 degrees, so you're not really working the knee joint to its full potential. But 6 inches, it's just enough to create an extreme stretch in the hip flexor rec fem of the back leg, while still allowing you to go down and forward like in the escalator analogy. So you want to progress these over time, these 3 progressions, but you also want to progress the implement. So like I said earlier, you want to start with a pulley, then you can progress to dumbbells, where now the center of mass is lower, which makes it easier. Then a third progression would be barbell on the back. Now if you're using a classic barbell, which is 7 feet long, what happens on top of being higher on your torso, that the length of the barbell requires you to balance sideways. So the QL will be activated, the core stabilizer muscles will be activated on top of it. And then for the really advanced athletes, you could actually progress split squat to a front rack position as if you were doing a front squat, which is a more advanced version of the split squat. So you progress with the elevation of the foot from elevated to flat to rear foot elevated, to a progression of implements from pulley to dumbbell to barbell to front rack position. I noticed that, so the question is, I noticed that you rarely prescribe Petersen step-up reps higher than 12, but can you prescribe higher reps since it's a short range of motion? So that's a good question, because technically, yes, like very short range of motion movements, it allows you to do more reps because the time under tension is so low. Like for example, the heel elevated step-up, also known as the Pollock step-up, like you can do 20, 25 reps on this, but the reason why you can do so many reps, even though it's a short range of motion, is because the heel, the foot, is supported on a slant board, on a wedge. So now the whole balance component is taken out of the equation. But the problem with the Petersen step-up, although the range of motion is so short, the technical difficulty of the Petersen, because of the balance and the coordination required, although it's short range of motion, do not attempt to do it for more than 12 reps. The quality will plummet. Okay, so, and even 12, it's still a lot of reps. Like for the most part, when I start with someone, I actually start at 6 reps. If you can give me 6 perfectly done reps, that's great. And then you build up the reps all the way up to 12. But I'm telling you, if you go higher than 12 on Petersen step up, then the technique gets thrown out of the window and you're not getting much out of it. So it's one that's more for a medium range rep, although it's a short range movement.